And I'm going to use this teaching, the last shall be first and the first shall be last, really to anchor my reflections, looking back at this year of COVID and trying to make meaning from it. And of course, the experience of COVID and what we've all gone through personally and as a wider world is really what I'm reflecting on today. But first, I'd like to start with a little story from years ago. Many years ago, I went to visit Alaska. It's a really beautiful place. And I went to a kind of living museum in a Native American community. And there were I'm always fascinated looking back at different ways of life, especially the indigenous culture of this continent. And one thing that has stuck with me, maybe after, this was maybe over a decade ago, there was this communal hut that they would create that they lived in during the winter, a very large round hut. In Alaska, of course, it gets completely dark during the winter. And so they couldn't do any work, and they all lived together in one hut to stay warm. And they told stories and did crafts and shared food together. And they lived in this huge extended family. And then they had, a seasonal economy. They went where the salmon went. And they had just an amazing way of life that has always made me think, because it's such a sharp contrast with how individualistic our way of life is, and how much, no matter what's going on in the seasons, we just do exactly the same thing. Whether it's the dead of winter, you're still working 9 to 5, and you're still, we're more oriented towards, I think, our socioeconomic reality. We're much less oriented towards the natural world around us and responding to kind of that more, not the socially constructed reality, but the actual reality, the environmental reality. We tend to ignore it, actually. But the pandemic has forced us to pay attention to our environmental reality, the conditions within which we live. And it's forced our society to do some reflection and to do some adaptation and to change. So this is one of the gifts of the pandemic, and it's one of the things I want to talk about today. When we have a crisis like this virus that we all need to respond to, one of the blessings is that it puts a pause on business as usual, and it moves us into a different state of acting. I'm not saying I love being in crisis mode. I really don't. It's very exhausting. But what I do love is being in solidarity mode, which is what I feel began to happen as the pandemic hit. I think there was a kind of instinctual return to a sense of community, to a sense of caring for each other and thinking about the well-being of the whole. And all of a sudden, I think in our society, we began to pay just a little more attention to the people who are struggling most in our society, because things got worse. And if we didn't do something, for example, with extending unemployment or providing some kind of stimulus, the poverty rates would have been so explosive, probably our society would have fallen apart. So we had to respond in some way. And so we began to pay more attention, and I think in the summer, when George Floyd was killed, a nerve was hit in this country and we began to look at that point in our society where the major dysfunction is most visible, and that is our racism. And for me, when I look back on the year, the big story for me is that we're raising our awareness about the problem of racism in our society. And I want to reflect a little bit about why I believe that this problem is so essential and so important for us to take a look at and to see what is really ill with our society. And when I look at that passage, Jesus' passage, his teaching about the last shall be first and the first shall be last, this is in the spirit too, because in this country, we are never going to be what we can be in terms of a life-affirming society where each person has value and reaches their potential until we go back and realize the fundamental problem with our society, which is that it has not assigned value to human life or other forms of life as a general rule. And there's nowhere that's more clear than when we look at the history of slavery and when we look at the history of genocide against Native peoples. How could we begin a society and structure a society where whole huge amounts of people were assigned zero intrinsic value? Absolutely zero. Meaning they were not valued for being human beings. They were only valued for labor. For the colonizers, the indigenous people were just an obstacle to occupation. So they were either murdered or they were pushed onto lands that the colonists viewed as being worthless for development. And that was just incredibly cruel and just unfathomable to view people as having no value at all. Same with slavery, which was just the most massive scaled human exploitation the world has ever seen. The slave trade that built this country was just horrendous and so barbaric and cruel, and it was all designed to just squeeze the labor out of people and just treat them as worthless in the process. And so when we wake up in this pandemic and start to say, wow, we're living in a society that doesn't care for so many people who are poor, who don't have health care, who, wow, now that they're in a pandemic, we better do something or else a whole bunch of people, we don't even know what will happen to them. And then I think it's just very natural that we began to look at racism and we began to look at this core problem because we have a basic value dysfunction because we're built on a disregard for human life and we're built on a disregard for environmental life. And why? It's because we're built as an economy and a society to make money for a small amount of people in our version of capitalism. We're not designed to take care of all. We haven't designed that way. We've in fact designed to, in some cases, completely kill or enslave some for the benefit of the few. And that value just runs through our whole economy. no one has experienced it like black people in this country and indigenous people, and today also people of color. No one has experienced the dehumanization, I would say, as harshly. But and at the same time, white people have experienced dehumanization. Women especially have experienced dehumanization. It is not reserved for any one class of people. It is a fundamental value. Dehumanization for the sake of making money. And it's how our whole economy runs. And I think we kind of know this. And we are often in a kind of low-grade despair or tension with it. But with a community like ours, we're here together, and I believe that what we're trying to do is carve out a counterculture. That's part of what we do. In this community, everyone has intrinsic value. So we try to restore a sense of the sacredness of each person. We try to come at it from a truth that is within us that is sometimes, if not routinely, just negated by our society. And we have other kind of contradictory values that we promote, like cooperation rather than competition, and generosity, love instead of fear. So we're together kind of cultivating these alternative values, and I think that is part of why when this whole pandemic hit, all of a sudden our mission became a lot more relevant. And people were like, wow, this community seems like something I want to be part of or support, because I think that we embody that spirit of solidarity that began to kind of rise up as the pandemic pressed down on our society. And we've been in that space for a while, and that came more into focus, I feel, during this pandemic. It's kind of like the spiritual center could be a little bit like that kind of hut I described that the Alaskan indigenous people lived in together, where they told stories and they shared things and they were in connection. And we love the circle. If there's any metaphor we love and maybe overuse, it's the circle. So we're in a community together, and we're living out this kind of communitarian impulse at the same time as we're in the society that is just fundamentally oriented for corporate greed. And we all know this, because as much as we love these values that we choose to embody together in this free society, this center, this community, at the same time, we've got the other scripts running in our heads saying, you got to fend for yourself. You're all alone. And if you don't fight for what you deserve, you're going to be left in the garbage heap in this society. We've all got those scripts running because we understand how competitive and cruel this society is. We're all living in it. And we know that we're not intrinsically valued in the economy. We know that we're not. We're valued based on, it's sad, but unless you can build someone's wealth who is a wealthy shareholder somehow, you're not valued in this society. Unless you can do something that a wealthy person thinks is valuable, forget it. Now, that doesn't define our whole lives, but it defines, I think, our economic lives. And we know that it is not right, because there's no reason that people in our society should not have basic necessities because they're not adding to shareholder wealth. Why should that be? Why should we have no intrinsic value? You don't get health care or a place to live unless you make a shareholder, unless you maximize their profits somehow? To me, that sounds like slavery. And that, I think, is part of the fundamental illogic of our society, because I don't think we've ever shaken the foundation of slavery. I don't think we've ever shaken the model, the economic model of those who have resources those who are the shareholders or the slave owners, are going to be maximizing profit, and human lives don't matter. The environment does not matter. And whether you're exhausting the fields or whether you're destroying natural resources for profit or whether you're enslaving people, doesn't matter. And I think even as we've made some small reforms here, the base level of humanity in our society is so low. What we have accepted so far, starting at a place where human life could have zero intrinsic value, we're maybe getting a little bit further, but we are nowhere near where we truly should be, where all people have equal value. That's where we need to go, and we're nowhere near. And when Jesus says the first shall be last and the last shall be first, here's an important truth. The answers for our society are with the people who are now last. People of color, black people, indigenous people, other oppressed groups, the LGBTQ community, they have the answers for our society. Absolutely. Because they know what it means to be dehumanized. Completely dehumanized. That is the insight. We need to rehumanize each person in this society. And the first shall be last. It has to be that way. The people, the elites in this country have no insight on how to repair and heal. It is the last. They know what we need to do. That's why the voices of black activists in this time, the voices of the LGBTQ community, the voices of people who are poor need to be heard. And they are the ones that are speaking truth to me in this pandemic, to me in the most powerful way. And as a community, I want us to listen, because I just feel that this is the truth for us. Our society needs to be rebalanced. And as we come out of this pandemic, yes, I look forward to taking off the mask. I look forward to being free of kind of the daily trauma of this particular crisis. But we have to realize our nation is in a much bigger crisis. And we have to keep going with the solidarity. We have to keep pressing to meet human needs. We have to keep questioning those oppressive structures in our society, the thought patterns and the institutions. We can't really just go back to normal. It was not even good at all. It hasn't been good. Has never been great. It's been sadistic from the start. And it needs to be a love-centered world. That's what we stand for in this community. And that's why our message is more relevant. That's why what we're trying to do is more relevant, because we're trying to source those ways of life that are going to be life-giving for all, and that our society needs to adopt. So we as a community need to have our ears to the ground. We need to be listening to the voices of those who are last and bringing them forward, bringing them from the margins to the center of how we're thinking. And I feel that we've been doing a lot of that work, and I thank all the leaders in the community who have contributed to the study, to the reflection, and to the lifting up of new ideas within this community. And yes, Don, I see your post. Definitely, immigrants, definitely, who are so oppressed, especially the undocumented, because they're so dehumanized every day. These are the voices that we need to listen to, and we really need to keep going and grow with the solidarity and grow with the movement that we have generated in this last year.